It all started with a sound, or rather, the lack of one. The familiar, satisfying snikt of my workshop key turning in the lock was replaced by a dull, infuriating clank. I stopped, key halfway turned, and stared. My lock, a trusty old brass number I'd had for years, was gone. In its place was a monstrous, chrome-plated discus lock, the kind you see on corrugated steel doors of questionable businesses in industrial parks. It was shackled to my gate by a chain so thick it looked like it was stolen from a ship's anchor. This wasn't just a new lock. This was a statement. This was a declaration of war. I'm what you might call a dedicated hobbyist. My neighbors in the meticulously manicured, beige-on-beige hellscape of Oakwood Estates probably think I just tinker with cars. In reality, my garage, which I call the lab, and the larger detached workshop at the back of my property are my sanctuaries. They are places of creation, of controlled chaos, where the sweet smell of solder and sawdust hangs in the air like the world's best potpourri. And for the last 6 months, I'd been working on my magnum opus. Not a hot rod, not a piece of furniture, but something with more soul. I was building a platoon of animatronic garden gnomes. Stay with me. These weren't your garden variety, rosy-cheeked fishing gnomes. These were high-tech marvels of engineering, destined for the annual charity auction for the city's children's hospital. Each one had a custom-coded personality. One would tip his little red cap, another would polish his spectacles, and my personal favorite, Bartholomew, was programmed to look like he was telling a very long and fascinating story, complete with expressive hand gestures. The microcontroller work was delicate, the stuff I did in the lab. But the heavy fabrication, the waterproofing, the painting, that all happened in the workshop. And on this perfect, sun-drenched Saturday morning, I needed a specific can of sealant from the workshop to give Bartholomew his final, weatherproof coat. Which brought me back to the anchor chain and the lock that laughed at my puny key. My eyes scanned the gate, and of course I found it. Laminated. Zip-tied to a chain link with military precision. A single sheet of blindingly white paper, bearing the mark of the beast, the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association logo. The font was a cheerful, bubbly script that was somehow both condescending and aggressive. "Hello, neighbor. It has come to the attention of the Oakwood Estates Architectural Review Committee that your outbuilding is being used for activities not in keeping with the residential character of our community. Bylaw 7, Section 4A, Structures and Use. We have observed the delivery of industrial materials and have noted noises inconsistent with standard residential upkeep. To prevent further violations, and pending a formal review where you will surely be fined into the next century, I'm paraphrasing, but we all know that's the subtext, access has been temporarily restricted. Please contact the HOA office during business hours to schedule an inspection. Have a blessed day. Brenda, HOA President." Brenda. Of course, it was Brenda. A woman who patrolled our streets in her golf cart, the community watch vehicle, with the grim determination of a Cold War border guard. A woman who once tried to fine me because my garbage can was, and I quote, visible from the street for a period exceeding the 4-hour post-pickup grace window. A woman whose hair was sculpted into a blonde helmet that seemed impervious to wind, rain, or reason. I stood there, feeling the slow, hot burn of rage crawl up my neck. Temporarily restricted? That's a funny way of saying illegally imprisoning my private property. Inconsistent noises? That was me, occasionally using a jigsaw before 9 p.m. This wasn't about bylaws. This was about power. Brenda, in her infinite, beige-tinted wisdom, had decided my little corner of the world needed to be brought to heel. I looked at the lock. I looked at the note. I felt the familiar stages of suburban warfare brewing in my soul. Disbelief, fury, a brief, fleeting moment of despair where I considered just moving to a cabin in the woods. And then it was replaced by something else. A slow, creeping, glorious idea began to dawn. The cogs in my engineer's brain, usually occupied with servo motors and lines of code, started to turn in a wonderful, new, malicious direction. Brenda had made a classic villain mistake. She assumed she was dealing with some weekend gardener who'd be intimidated by a laminated notice. She wasn't. She was dealing with an engineer who saw rules not as boundaries, but as a system to be understood, exploited, and ultimately defeated. She had just locked me out of my workshop. She had no idea what she was about to lock in. I turned away from the gate, a slow smile spreading across my face. I looked toward my main garage, where a massive, gray, tarp-covered shape sat dormant, waiting for its moment. Brenda had declared war. She just didn't know my choice of weapon was a 20,000-pound instrument of precision-engineered spite. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't grab my angle grinder, though the temptation to turn that lock into a shower of incandescent sparks was almost overwhelming. An eye for an eye was too simple. This situation called for something more elegant. It called for disproportionate, yet completely legal retaliation. I walked back to the lab with the brisk, determined stride of a man on a mission. I flicked on the lights, ignored the sad, half-finished gnome on my workbench, and walked to the back of the garage. With a flourish that felt far more dramatic than it probably was, I grabbed a corner of the heavy canvas tarp and yanked. It fell to the floor with a soft whoosh, revealing my pandemic project. My white whale. My ace in the hole for the very apocalypse Brenda had just initiated. The Mobile Command Center. The MCC. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like an absurdly aggressive delivery truck. It was built on the bones of a Ford F-550 chassis, the kind they use for ambulances and small-town fire trucks. But the similarities ended there. From the cab back, it was a custom-built cube of matte, black, powder-coated aluminum. A sleek, windowless monolith that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was my answer to the question, what if a stealth bomber and a Swiss Army knife had a baby? I'd built it for a hypothetical future of off-grid camping trips, disaster relief volunteering, or, in the back of my mind, a situation exactly like this one. It had a reinforced roof supporting a 1,200-watt solar array, a self-seeking satellite dish for internet anywhere, and an independent power system with enough lithium-ion batteries to run a small house for 3 days. The sides were lined with flush-mounted locking tool chests. The rear wall wasn't a door, it was a ramp that lowered with a hydraulic hiss. I patted its cold metal flank. "Wakey, wakey, big guy," I murmured. "You're up." My rage had now been channeled into pure, focused energy. I had a 4-minute self-imposed mandate to go from a state of domestic lockdown to full operational freedom. I began the activation sequence, narrating it to myself in my head like a launch controller at Cape Canaveral. Minute 1. Power. I swung open the driver's door and slid into the surprisingly comfortable air ride captain's chair. I flipped a series of red-tagged toggle switches on a custom overhead console. A low hum vibrated through the chassis as the 400 amp-hour battery bank came online. Green lights blinked across a digital monitoring panel, showing me a full charge. The inverters spooled up, ready to turn DC battery power into pure, unadulterated 120-volt AC freedom. Power systems were nominal. Minute 2. Systems. I tapped a touchscreen display embedded in the dash. The onboard computer, a ruggedized mini PC I'd built myself, booted up in seconds. The satellite dish on the roof whirred to life, executing its silent ballet as it hunted for a signal. A moment later, a green icon appeared. Internet connection stable. I toggled another switch, and the external security cameras flickered on, giving me a 360-degree view of the Oakwood Estates battlefield. All systems go. Minute 3. Logistics. This was the physical part. I hopped out and strode around the vehicle with practiced efficiency. I unplugged the shore power trickle charger from the wall, coiling the thick cable and stowing it in an external bay. I gave each of the 6 heavy-duty tires a solid kick, not a scientific measure of pressure, but a deeply satisfying ritual. Finally, I hit a button on a remote, and with a series of powerful thunks, the 4 hydraulic stabilizing jacks retracted into the frame. The MCC settled onto its suspension with a gentle sigh. We were untethered. Minute 4, ignition. I climbed back into the driver's seat, the faint, clean smell of electronics and over-engineering filling my nostrils. I buckled up. I turned the key. The 6.7-liter Power-Stroke diesel engine turned over once, then twice, before erupting into a deep, throaty, ground-shaking rumble. This was not the polite purr of a neighbor's sedan. This was a sound that spoke of torque and purpose. It was a sound that did not belong in a place where the loudest permissible noise was the gentle fizz of a sprinkler head. It was the sound of sweet, sweet liberty. With the press of a button, my main garage door groaned its way open, revealing the sunlit, peaceful suburban street beyond. It felt like the opening of a hangar bay on a starship. I shifted the MCC into drive. The behemoth rolled forward, its weight and power feeling less like driving and more like piloting a land-based naval vessel. I navigated it down my short driveway, the tires making a soft crunching sound on the pristine asphalt. I didn't park it illegally. I didn't block anyone's driveway. I parked it directly on the public street, right in front of my own house, in a spot where any resident was legally allowed to park a vehicle for up to 72 hours for the purpose of loading or unloading. I shut off the engine. The sudden silence was punctuated by the distant sound of a bird chirping, blissfully unaware of the suburban Cold War that had just turned hot. Then, with a press of another button, I executed the pièce de résistance. The entire rear panel of the workshop cube unfolded, lowering via hydraulic pistons to become a heavy-duty ramp. It revealed the interior, a compact but brilliantly organized mobile workshop. A small workbench was bolted to the floor, complete with a vise and task lighting. Tools hung in perfect order on a magnetic wall. And right next to the workbench, gleaming in the morning sun, was my professional-grade, Italian-made double-boiler espresso machine, which I considered the most critical system on board. I walked to my garage fridge, grabbed an ice-cold can of soda, and then walked back to the MCC. I sat down on the edge of the lowered ramp, my feet dangling just above the curb. I cracked open the can, the psst sounding like a gunshot in the quiet air. I took a long, slow, satisfying sip, and I looked directly across the street at Brenda's house, waiting for the curtain to twitch. The war had begun, and I had just deployed my queen. It took less than 90 seconds. A sliver of movement in the bay window of Brenda's meticulously landscaped home. The curtain twitched, then flew back as if it had been slapped. I saw her silhouette, frozen for a moment, and I could almost feel the waves of sheer, uncomprehending rage radiating across the asphalt. The front door of her beige palace flew open with a bang. Brenda emerged, not in her usual golf cart, but on foot, which meant this was serious. She was wearing a pink tracksuit that screamed, "Power walking with a vengeance." Her face, as she stomped across her chemically treated lawn and onto the street, was a beautiful ballet of emotions. It started with confusion, as if her brain was struggling to categorize the matte, black monolith that had materialized on her street. That morphed into recognition, her eyes flicking from the MCC to me, sitting casually on its ramp. And finally, it settled into a look of pure, unadulterated fury that made her face pinch up like a dried apple. "Alexander!" she barked, her voice tight and high. She had a way of saying my full name that made it sound like an accusation. "What is that?" She gestured toward the MCC with a trembling, accusatory finger, as if it were a dead animal I had dragged onto her doorstep. I took another leisurely sip of my soda before answering, making sure to swallow with an audible gulp. "This, Brenda, good morning to you too," I said, my voice dripping with faux politeness. "This is my recreational vehicle, the Nomad 550. A bit of a passion project. Fully street legal, of course. Registered, insured, the works. Just getting her ready for a little trip." Her eyes narrowed. She was processing, running my words through the twisted legal lexicon of the HOA bylaws stored in her head. "You can't park that thing here," she snapped. "Actually, I can," I countered, keeping my tone light and conversational. It's a tactic I learned years ago. The madder they get, the calmer you become. It's like verbal jujitsu. According to City Ordinance 11-4B, subsection C, a resident is permitted to park a registered recreational vehicle on a public street adjacent to their property for a period not to exceed 72 hours for the purposes of loading, unloading, and maintenance. I'm just, I gestured vaguely towards my house. Loading. Seems my primary loading area, I paused and pointed directly at the new lock on my workshop, is temporarily restricted. Big shame, that. Brenda's jaw worked silently for a moment. She was short-circuiting. My calm, ordinance-quoting demeanor was not in her script. She had expected me to be angry, to be yelling, perhaps to be trying to cut the lock with a hacksaw. She had not expected this. "That is not a recreational vehicle," she finally managed to say, her voice rising. It's an industrial monstrosity. It lowers our property values just by existing." "Well, the DMV classifies it as an RV, and I tend to think they have a bit more authority on the matter than the Oakwood Architectural Review Committee. No offense," I said, giving her a completely insincere smile. As for property values, I think the giant, rusty-looking chain and industrial padlock on my gate probably aren't helping much either. Tends to give off a real condemned property vibe, She sputtered, a flush creeping up her neck and clashing horribly with the pink of her tracksuit. "I will be reporting this, Alexander. To the board, to the city, to everyone." "You do that," I said cheerfully. "In the meantime, I've got a deadline." I stood up, placed my empty soda can in a small recycling bin I'd conveniently mounted just inside the MCC's ramp, and turned to my mobile workbench. I pulled out a small, foldable work table and a camping chair, setting them up right there on the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the curb. Public property. From one of the MCC's external compartments, I retrieved Bartholomew, the storyteller gnome, and my electronics kit. I sat down, switched on my soldering iron, powered by the silent, sun-fueled batteries of the MCC, and got to work, whistling a tuneless melody. Brenda stood there for another 10 seconds, frozen in impotent rage, before turning on her heel and stomping back to her house. The door slammed shut with a sound that echoed my own satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. I had established a forward operating base. I had engaged the enemy and repelled her initial assault using nothing but a calm tone and a working knowledge of municipal code. And best of all, I was back to work on my gnomes. I gave Bartholomew a little pat on his pointy hat. We had won the first battle, but I knew with every fiber of my being the war was just getting started. I could already hear Brenda on the phone, her voice a shrill harbinger of the next wave of attack. It took less than an hour for the cavalry to arrive. Brenda's cavalry, that is. A pristine white police cruiser from the Northwood Police Department rolled silently down our street and parked about 20 feet behind the MCC. I'd been expecting it. In fact, I'd been counting on it. 2 officers got out. The first was older, with a mustache that had seen its share of stakeouts and a look of deep, profound weariness etched onto his face. This was Officer Dave. His partner was younger, sharper, with a crisp uniform and an air of by-the-book professionalism. Officer Ramirez. They ambled over, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the flicker of curiosity in their eyes as they took in the full, bizarre tableau. The manicured suburban street, my gleaming black command center, and me, sitting on a camping chair performing delicate soldering work on a garden gnome. Brenda had practically teleported onto her front porch the moment the cruiser appeared. She stood there now, arms crossed, radiating a smug, I told you so energy that was so potent I was surprised it didn't set off car alarms. "Good morning, officers," I said, setting down my tools and standing up. I gave them a friendly, non-threatening nod. "Morning, sir," said Officer Dave, his eyes scanning the MCC from end to end. "We got a call about a commercial vehicle parked on the street, causing a disturbance." "A commercial vehicle?" I asked, feigning surprise. "Oh no, this is strictly for recreation. The Nomad 550. Great for getting away from it all." I gave a subtle but pointed look towards Brenda's house. Brenda, seeing her opportunity, marched over, her pink tracksuit a flash of righteous indignation against the green of my lawn. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "This man," she pointed at me, "has parked this beast in our quiet neighborhood. It's an eyesore, it's noisy, and he's clearly running some kind of illegal business out of it." Officer Ramirez turned to me. "Sir, are you conducting business from this vehicle?" This was the moment. This was the first legal test. I'd prepped for it like a final exam. "Absolutely not, officer," I said calmly. "This is a personal hobby. I'm making some decorations for a charity auction, for the Children's Hospital." I picked up Bartholomew the gnome and showed him to them. "This is Bartholomew. He's going to raise a lot of money for sick kids." Officer Dave's mustache twitched. I think it was trying to hide a smile. "As for why I'm out here on the street," I continued, "well, that's the interesting part. I walked them over to my workshop gate. My workshop, where I normally do my hobbying, has been, how did she put it? Temporarily restricted." I held up my phone, which had a crystal-clear picture of Brenda's laminated note, the text perfectly legible. "Exhibit A, sent this morning by that woman right there," I said, nodding at Brenda. "She took it upon herself to illegally lock me out of my own property, so I was left with a choice, either abandon my commitments to the charity or find a creative and legal workaround. I chose the latter." Officer Dave took the phone and studied the picture. He looked at the industrial lock on my gate. He looked back at Brenda, whose smug expression was beginning to melt like cheap ice cream on hot asphalt. "Furthermore," I added, walking back to the MCC, "the vehicle is registered as an RV with the state. Here's the registration." I opened an external compartment and produced a waterproof document holder with all my paperwork, clean and in order. And the insurance. And as per City Ordinance 11-4B, I'm legally allowed to be here for 72 hours. It's been, I checked my watch, roughly 1 hour and 12 minutes. So I've got about 70 hours and 48 minutes of legal parking time left. Officer Ramirez took the documents and reviewed them. He nodded slowly. He looked at his partner. Officer Dave handed my phone back and sighed the heavy sigh of a man who just wanted to finish his shift without dealing with a suburban turf war. He turned to Brenda. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "Ma'am, his paperwork is in order. His vehicle is legally registered and legally parked. He's not violating any noise ordinances. There is nothing we can do." But look at it!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. It's a menace! Ma'am, Officer Dave said, his patience wearing visibly thin. Frankly, the only potential crime I see here is the one you committed. Unlawful restraint of private property is a serious issue. He'd be well within his rights to cut that lock off and bill you for the damages. The fact that he's chosen to do this, he gestured to the entire magnificent scene, is, a creative solution, but it is not an illegal one. We cannot ask him to move. He tipped his hat to me. Sir, try to keep the gnome-related disturbances to a minimum. Will do, officer, I said with a solemn nod. Dave and Ramirez turned and walked back to their cruiser, their shoulders shaking slightly. I'm pretty sure they were laughing. They got in the car and drove away, leaving Brenda standing in the middle of the street, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Her weapon, calling the authorities, had been turned against her. She was utterly, comprehensively defeated. She shot me a look of pure venom, a silent promise that this was far from over, before spinning on her heel and power-walking back to her house. The door slammed shut again, this time with the force of a thwarted tyrant. I smiled, picked up my soldering iron, and got back to work on Bartholomew's wiring. Round 2 was mine. By early afternoon, I had hit a logistical snag. The charity auction was in 2 weeks, and I was running low on some critical supplies. Specifically, I needed a large sheet of 1/4-inch acrylic for the gnome's display cases and a box of high-torque servo motors I'd special ordered. My supplier, a no-nonsense industrial plastics and electronics depot across town, was Gus's Custom Fabrication. Gus was a man who communicated primarily through grunts and invoices, and according to my tracking information, his delivery truck was about 10 minutes away. Normally, this would be fine. The truck would pull into my long driveway, and we'd unload right at the workshop. But with the gate locked, my driveway was now just a long, useless strip of asphalt. The delivery would have to happen on the street, and it would have to be loaded directly into the MCC. A few minutes later, a vehicle that made my MCC look positively svelte rumbled down the street. It was Gus's flatbed truck, a rust-colored beast of burden that looked like it had survived several minor wars. It groaned to a halt, and out jumped a man who was built exactly like a refrigerator. Gus. He had a massive graying beard, a faded flannel shirt, and an expression that suggested he'd just been told his favorite dog had died. This was his default expression. He stood in the street, thumbs hooked in his jeans, and just stared. He took in my pleasant suburban house, the locked gate with its comically large padlock, and the matte black command center parked at the curb. He looked at me, sitting in my camping chair next to a half-assembled gnome. His eyes narrowed. He was trying to solve a very confusing equation. "Alex," he grunted. It was a statement, not a question. "Gus," I said, getting up and wiping my hands on a rag. "Good to see you. Got my acrylic?" "Got your acrylic," he confirmed, still not moving. He gestured with his chin towards the MCC. "What in the Sam Hill is that?" "That, my friend, is Plan B," I said. I gave him the 30-second rundown. The HOA, the power-tripping president, the lock, the note, the cops. I explained my predicament with the delivery. Gus listened, his stone-faced expression unchanging. When I was done, he walked past me without a word. He went right up to my gate and inspected the lock and chain. He gave the chain a solid tug. It didn't budge. He grunted, a sound of grudging respect for the hardware, if not the person who put it there. Then he walked over to the MCC. He circled it slowly, like a wolf inspecting a potential rival. He ran a calloused hand over the aluminum plating. He squinted at the solar panels. He peered at the retracted hydraulic jacks. Then he walked up the ramp and stuck his head inside. He was silent for a long time. I could see his head swiveling, taking in the organized tool wall, the compact workbench, the wiring harnesses I'd run along the ceiling. And then his eyes landed on the espresso machine. He pulled his head out and looked at me. For the first time, his expression changed. A flicker of something, curiosity, respect, danced in his eyes. "You got an espresso machine in this thing?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Double boiler, PID controlled, direct plumbed to the onboard water tank," I said proudly. "Want one? I can have a perfect latte ready in about 90 seconds. Gus stroked his beard, a slow, thoughtful motion. "Yeah, all right," he said. He then turned to his truck where his young, lanky assistant was waiting. "All right, kid, bring the sheet over here, and be careful with it." He'd made his decision. He was on my side. What followed was a masterpiece of logistical improvisation. Gus, with the practiced eye of a man who has loaded impossible things into improbable spaces his entire life, directed the operation. We couldn't lay the 4 by 8 foot acrylic sheet flat, so we carefully angled it in, securing it to the wall with bungee cords I conveniently had stored in an external compartment. The box of servo motors fit neatly under the workbench. It was a tight fit, but we made it work without a single scratch. As his assistant was securing the last strap, I handed Gus a steaming ceramic mug of perfectly frothed latte. He took a sip. His eyes widened slightly. "Huh, not bad," he grunted. This was the highest form of praise in the Gus lexicon. He drained half the cup in one go, handed the mug back, and gave me a solid, back-thumping clap on the shoulder. "Kid, I've worked in neighborhoods with private security and guys who measure your grass with a ruler. This," he swept his hand to encompass the entire ridiculous scene, "is next level. I like it." He pulled a business card from his wallet. "Call me if you need anything," he said, and his tone was different now. It wasn't just a casual offer. "Anything at all. A generator, a forklift, a distraction, you call me." He gave me a nod of respect that felt more valuable than 1,000 HOA approvals, climbed back into his war rig, and rumbled away. I stood there, watching him go, feeling a new sense of power. I didn't just have a mobile command center anymore. I had allies. The game was changing. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the battlefield of Oakwood Estates, a new realization dawned on me. I had been thinking defensively, reactively. The MCC wasn't just a tool for circumvention, it was a platform. It was time to go on the offensive. It was time for a little psychological warfare. My first target was the soundscape. Brenda's house was a tomb of silence, a vacuum of joy. I decided it needed a soundtrack. The MCC was equipped with a set of surprisingly high-fidelity, weatherproof external speakers, which I'd installed for listening to podcasts while working outside. Their moment had come. I started subtly. I patched my phone into the system and put on a playlist of painfully generic corporate hold music, the kind of light jazz and tinkling piano that slowly drives you insane when you're trying to dispute a bill. I didn't blast it. I played it just loud enough that if you were sitting in Brenda's living room, you'd be able to hear it. A faint, maddening, inescapable melody. After an hour of that, I escalated. I switched to broadcasting audiobooks, but not exciting ones. I chose the most famously long and boring novels I could find. I started with Herman Melville's Moby Dick, narrated by a man with a deep, monotonous, sleep-inducing voice. The sound of "Call Me Ishmael" drifted across the manicured lawns like a ghostly whisper. From my vantage point, I could see Brenda's curtains twitching with increasing frequency. When night fell, I moved on to visual warfare. The MCC had a powerful mast-mounted LED spotlight I used for late-night repairs. It also had a compact high-lumen projector I kept for outdoor movie nights. I mounted the projector to the roof of the MCC, aimed it at the big blank beige wall on the side of my own house, and plugged it into my laptop. My first projection was innocent enough, a live 24/7 kitten cam from a local animal shelter. Adorable, fluffy kittens tumbled and played on a 20-foot-high screen, perfectly visible from Brenda's front window. Who could complain about kittens? It was a test of her resolve. After an hour of kittens, I switched to a 10-hour-long 4K loop of a crackling fireplace. The warm, flickering light created a cozy, inviting ambiance that was the complete antithesis of everything Brenda stood for. It was a projection of pure, unadulterated Higa. The community was starting to take notice. The evening dog walkers, usually a grim, silent procession, now lingered. They'd stop, watch the giant kittens for a moment, and give me a subtle nod or a thumbs up. I saw Mr. Henderson from 3 doors down chuckle into his hand as he walked by. I was becoming a spectacle, a folk hero. Emboldened, I decided to lean into my new role. I brought out a large cooler from the lab, filled it with ice and cans of soda and bottles of water, and placed it on the curb next to a small, handwritten sign that read, "Hydration Station for the Resistance. Please enjoy." The next morning, I delivered my masterpiece of passive aggression. I held what I formally dubbed the first daily briefing on the Oakwood Estates logistical crisis. I set up a small lectern, which I happened to have in the MCC, of course, put on a blazer over my t-shirt, and stood before my press corps, a bemused-looking Mrs. Gable and her golden retriever. Using the MCC's speaker as a PA system, I began. "Good morning," I said in my most serious, authoritative voice. "At 0800 hours, we are entering Day 2 of the standoff. Operations continue unabated thanks to the robust off-grid capabilities of the mobile command center. Morale is high." Brenda's front door opened. She stood there, wrapped in a bathrobe, her face a mask of thunderous disbelief. "Last night's PSYOPs were a resounding success," I continued, looking directly at her. "Phase 1, acoustic annoyance, has been completed. Phase 2, visual whimsy, is ongoing. Today we will also be receiving a shipment of non-GMO organic birdseed to promote a more vibrant and diverse avian ecosystem, in stark contrast to the sterile monocultural landscape previously enforced." Mrs. Gable's retriever barked, which I took as a round of applause. Brenda, looking like she was about to have an aneurysm, retreated inside and slammed the door. I was having fun. Too much fun. But the more I leaned into the absurdity, the more the neighborhood seemed to rally behind me. People weren't just walking by anymore. They were stopping to chat, offering words of encouragement, and grabbing a cold drink from the cooler. I had accidentally started a movement. My little patch of grass between the curb and the sidewalk had become the town square, the speaker's corner, the social hub of the entire neighborhood. And all of it, every last bit, was powered by Brenda's spite and my sun-powered pettiness. Brenda, having failed to defeat me with direct confrontation or by calling in the authorities, retreated to her natural habitat, the place where she was queen, general, and executioner all in one. The world of paperwork. The paper war began on Monday morning. My mailbox, usually a repository for junk mail and the occasional bill, suddenly became a war front. It started with a single, crisp white envelope, the HOA logo embossed in the corner. I opened it with the cautious curiosity of a bomb disposal expert. Official notice of violation. Violation code RC 113B, Architectural Review Committee. Infraction, unapproved vehicle color. Description: a large vehicle, matte black in color, has been parked at the residence. Per the Oakwood Estates approved color palette. See Appendix C, page 47. Matte black is not a sanctioned vehicular hue. Remedy: repaint the vehicle in an approved color, for example, desert tan. Subtle sage. Gentle Fawn. Within 7 days. Fine. $50 per day until rectified. I laughed out loud. It was so beautifully, perfectly absurd. Gentle Fawn? My MCC would rather self-destruct. The next day there were 2 envelopes. The first was for improper use of public thoroughfare for business purposes, citing Gus's delivery truck as evidence of a commercial enterprise. The fine was a steep $100 a day, retroactive to the day of the delivery. The second was even more creative. Official notice of violation, violation code, COM 204, community standards. Infraction, unsanctioned community gathering. Description, resident has encouraged and facilitated the congregation of multiple homeowners on public property, creating a potential nuisance. Remedy, disperse any and all gatherings immediately. Fine, $75. She was fining me for people talking to me. She was fining me for being popular. By Wednesday, it was a daily ritual. I'd retrieve a new batch of violations, each one more desperate and unhinged than the last. I got a notice for non-standard lawn ornamentation, the free soda cooler. I received a citation for unauthorized projection of feline imagery, which was my personal favorite. My daily briefings earned me a stern warning for operating an unlicensed public address system. Brenda was trying to bury me in paper, to nickel and dime me into submission. She thought I would be intimidated. She thought I would argue, or plead, or pay the fines. I did none of those things. Instead, I went to a craft store. I bought a dozen cheap black 8x10 picture frames. That afternoon, I began a new project. I took the first violation notice, the one for the unapproved vehicle color, and framed it. Then I mounted it on the large, flat side of the MCC, right at eye level, using heavy-duty magnetic hooks. I did the same for the second notice, and the third, and the fourth. I arranged them in a neat, orderly grid. It was a gallery exhibition of pettiness, a museum of bureaucratic malice. I called it Brenda's Wall of Shame. The effect was immediate and profound. What were once private threats hidden in envelopes were now public pronouncements of her lunacy. The dog walkers would stop and read them, shaking their heads and chuckling. Kids on bikes would point them out to each other. Mr. Henderson came by and spent a full 5 minutes studying the collection before turning to me and saying, "This is better than television." The Wall of Shame transformed the narrative. I wasn't the neighborhood troublemaker anymore. I was the curator of a public art installation, exposing the absurdity of our suburban overlord. The violation notices, intended as weapons to isolate and punish me, had become my greatest propaganda tool. Brenda must have seen it from her window. She must have watched as neighbor after neighbor stopped to read her words, her threats, her unhinged attempts to control every aspect of our lives. The fines and warnings kept coming, arriving each morning like clockwork. And each day I would solemnly frame the new additions and add them to my ever-growing gallery. Each new frame was another nail in her coffin, another testament to the fact that she had picked a fight with a man who understood that the best way to fight insanity is to put it on public display. I knew the Wall of Shame would push Brenda over the edge. I just didn't know how she would lash out. The answer came on Friday morning, just after dawn. I was inside the MCC, enjoying a perfectly pulled espresso and reviewing the schematics for my final gnome, when a subtle change in the light caught my eye. I looked at my external camera monitor. A beige Toyota minivan was slowly, deliberately, parking directly in front of the MCC, leaving less than a foot of clearance from my front bumper. At the same time, a silver Honda Odyssey was pulling up behind me, mirroring the action, its rear bumper practically kissing mine. I recognized the vehicles. They belonged to the Fentons and the Clarks, Brenda's most loyal and humorless disciples. I was boxed in, trapped. It was a siege. This was a major escalation. Annoying me with notes and fines was one thing. Physically barricading me was another. My good humor began to evaporate, replaced by a cold knot of anger. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was aggressive. This was a direct challenge. This was the suburban equivalent of a naval blockade. I stepped out of the MCC and onto the ramp to survey the scene. Sure enough, there was Brenda, standing on her lawn, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk on her face. Mr. Fenton and Mrs. Clark were standing beside her, looking smug. They had me. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't move backward. They had neutralized my greatest asset. For a moment, a flicker of doubt hit me. Had I pushed it too far? Was this the part where my clever protest collapsed into a humiliating defeat? I was trapped. My project timeline was in jeopardy, and my glorious mobile fortress had been reduced to a stationary metal box. It seemed like Brenda had finally found a way to win. Then I looked at her face. The sheer, unadulterated glee in her eyes. The smug satisfaction of a tyrant who believes she has finally crushed the rebellion. And that's when my doubt vanished, replaced by a steely resolve. She thought she was playing checkers. It was time to remind her I was playing chess. I gave her a long, unblinking stare. I wanted her to see that she hadn't broken me. Then I slowly and deliberately turned my back on her, walked back into the MCC, and calmly picked up my phone. I didn't call the police. The cops had already made it clear this was a civil matter, and while this was pushing the line, I had a feeling they'd just tell us to play nice. I needed a different kind of solution. I needed someone who operated on a different set of rules. I needed someone who understood leverage and logistics. I scrolled through my contacts and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a familiar grunt answered. "Gus?" "Gus, it's Alex," I said, my voice steady. "Remember how you said to call if I needed anything?" I could hear the sound of heavy machinery in the background, the shriek of metal on metal. "What do you need?" he asked, no nonsense in his tone. A slow smile spread across my face. "I need some traffic management," I said. "Brenda and her friends have me blockaded. I'm thinking a tow truck might be a good way to open negotiations. Or maybe 3 of them." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low chuckle that sounded like rocks tumbling in a dryer. "Traffic management," Gus rumbled. "I can do that. Don't move. I'll be there in 20. The line went dead. I walked to the front of the MCC, leaned against the dashboard, and looked out the windshield at Brenda and her co-conspirators. They were still standing there, basking in their victory. They had no idea what was coming. The cavalry was on its way. 20 minutes later, the ground began to tremble. It started as a low, distant rumble, a sound that made the coffee in my mug vibrate. Brenda and her cronies stopped their self-congratulatory chatter and looked down the street. Their smug expressions faltered, replaced by confusion. The rumble grew into a roar, and then the convoy came into view. It was glorious. Leading the procession was Gus's rust-colored flatbed, looking more like an instrument of war than ever. Following close behind wasn't one tow truck, but 2. One was a standard flatbed tow truck. The other was a massive, heavy-duty wrecker, the kind they use to pull semi-trucks out of ditches, its boom arm towering over the suburban rooftops like a metal giraffe. And for good measure, bringing up the rear, was a bright yellow cherry picker, the kind used for working on power lines. The convoy ground to a halt, engines idling with a menacing growl, effectively blockading the entire street. Gus hopped down from his cab, followed by his lanky assistant and 5 other guys who looked like they'd just stepped out of a casting call for a show called Toughest Guys in the World. They were all wearing grease-stained shirts and steel-toed boots. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, a silent, intimidating wall of flannel and muscle. Brenda, Mr. Fenton, and Mrs. Clark were frozen, their jaws hanging open. This was not in their plan. They had expected me to yell, to call the cops, to admit defeat. They had not expected me to summon a private army. Gus, holding a clipboard and a metal measuring tape, became the picture of calm, intimidating professionalism. He strode over to Mr. Fenton's beige minivan. "Morning," he grunted. He didn't wait for a reply. He unspooled his measuring tape and meticulously measured the distance from the minivan's front tire to the curb. He squinted at the number. He made a note on his clipboard. "Sir," Gus said, his voice a low growl that carried across the silent street. "Are you aware that your vehicle is parked in a designated contractor loading zone?" Mr. Fenton blinked. "A what? This is a public street." "Not today, it ain't," Gus said flatly. "I have a scheduled delivery and pickup of sensitive electronic components for this address." He jabbed a thumb toward my house. "As such, this area is a temporary loading zone under City Municipal Code 23C, subsection 4, Commercial Contractor Access. Your vehicle is also parked," he consulted his clipboard again, 7.5 inches from the curb. "A clear violation of city parking statutes. That's a towable offense." My jaw almost hit the floor. City Code 23C didn't exist. He had just invented it, right there on the spot, with the confidence of a Supreme Court justice. It was breathtaking. He turned his attention to Mrs. Clark, whose face had gone pale. "Ma'am, same goes for you. You're obstructing commercial access." He then gestured to the massive tow truck. "This here is Big Mike's Towing. He's on city contract. We have to clear the zone before we can begin our work. Now we can do this one of two ways. You can move your vehicles, or Big Mike can move them for you. His way involves a trip to the impound lot and a significant fee. Your choice." "The clock," he tapped his clipboard, "is ticking." The standoff lasted for about 10 seconds of beautiful, thick silence. It was the Fentons and the Clarks versus Gus's army, and the very real, very intimidating presence of Big Mike's wrecker. Mr. Fenton cracked first. "This is ridiculous. I'm not moving," he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Gus didn't even look at him. He just raised his hand and gave a slight nod to the driver of the heavy-duty tow truck. The driver responded by firing up the truck's PTO, and the massive winch on the back began to whir menacingly. That was it. That was the sound that broke them. "All right, fine, we're moving," Mrs. Clark shrieked, fumbling for her keys. Mr. Fenton, muttering under his breath about thugs and insanity, scrambled for his minivan. In less than a minute, both vehicles were gone, scurrying back to the safety of their driveways. The siege was broken. Brenda was left standing alone in the middle of the street, her face a thunderous mask of defeat. She looked at Gus's crew. She looked at the tow trucks. She looked at me, leaning against the MCC, a wide grin spreading across my face. She had been outmaneuvered, outmuscled, and publicly humiliated. Gus walked over to me. He clapped me on the shoulder again. "Traffic's all clear," he grunted. "Gus, I don't know how to thank you. What do I owe you?" I asked. He just shook his head. "Don't worry about it, kid. This was fun." He looked over at the wall of shame on the side of the MCC, and a genuine, rare smile cracked his beard. "Consider it a professional courtesy. Let me know when you want to get that lock cut off." With a final nod, he and his crew packed up their formidable convoy and rumbled away, leaving blessed silence and open road in their wake. Brenda shot me one last look of pure, impotent hatred before storming back into her house. The blockade was over. I had won the battle. But Brenda, I knew, would not take this defeat lying down. She had lost the battle of the street. Her next move would be to take the fight to her own turf, the HOA meeting, and I would be ready. Brenda's final, desperate gambit came in the form of an email blast to the entire neighborhood. The subject line, in all caps, read, "Emergency HOA meeting regarding egregious violations at 112 Oak Street." That was me. The body of the email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive prose, detailing a rogue resident whose actions were jeopardizing the peace, tranquility, and property values of our community. The agenda had only one item: a vote on invoking Bylaw 14, Section 8, forced rectification and possible liens, a vaguely worded nuclear option that essentially allowed the HOA to forcibly remove my nuisances and bill me into oblivion, potentially even putting a lien on my house. She was going for the kill. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the community clubhouse, a sterile, joyless building that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and shattered dreams. For the next 24 hours, I prepared. I didn't work on my gnomes. I didn't broadcast any more audiobooks. I turned the MCC from a workshop into a war room. I compiled documents, organized photos, and prepared my defense. I showed up to the meeting not in my usual t-shirt and jeans, but in a clean, dark blazer, holding a laptop. I looked less like a neighborhood eccentric and more like a man who was about to give a TED Talk on the art of suburban warfare. The clubhouse was packed. It seemed the entire neighborhood had turned out for the public execution. Brenda sat at the head of a long table with the other two board members, looking grim and self-important. She banged a gavel, called the meeting to order, and launched into a fiery 15-minute tirade against me. She painted me as a monster. The MCC was a death trap. My hobby was a secretive, illegal business. The gatherings of neighbors were unruly mobs. The wall of shame was an act of aggression. She finished her speech, breathless and red-faced, and looked at me. "Mr. Jensen," she said, using my last name like it was a curse, "do you have anything to say for yourself before the board votes?" "I do, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear. "With the board's permission, I have a short presentation." I didn't wait for an answer. I walked to the front of the room, where a projector screen was set up. I connected my laptop. The projector, which I'd brought from the MCC, hummed to life. The first slide was simple, in big, bold letters. A simple timeline of events. "Ladies and gentlemen neighbors," I began, "I won't waste your time with opinions. I'm just going to present you with the facts." I clicked to the next slide. It was a picture of my workshop gate, dated before the incident. The next slide showed the gate with Brenda's industrial lock and chain. Fact: on the morning of Saturday, June 7th, my private property was illegally secured without my consent by the HOA president. Click. The next slide was a high-resolution, close-up photo of Brenda's laminated note. I read it aloud, my voice flat and emotionless. The room was silent. Click. Fact: over the next 5 days, I received a total of 11 violation notices for activities that were either legal or entirely fabricated. I then showed a slide for each violation, a digital version of my wall of shame. When I got to the unauthorized projection of feline imagery slide, complete with a picture of the giant kitten, a ripple of laughter went through the room. Brenda's face tightened. Click. Fact: the unruly mobs and unsanctioned gatherings were our neighbors, many of you in this room stopping to chat on a public sidewalk. I showed a pleasant photo my security camera had captured of me talking with Mr. Henderson and his dog. Click. Then I played the audio. It was from my doorbell camera, crystal clear. It was Brenda, during one of her earlier confrontations, shouting, "I will have you thrown out of this neighborhood, Alexander. I will see to it personally." Gasps rippled through the audience. This wasn't a dispute about rules anymore. This was a personal vendetta, and everyone could hear it. "Now," I said, my voice softening, let's talk about the secretive, illegal business I've been running. Click. The next slide was a photo of Bartholomew the Gnome, fully assembled and painted, looking wise and whimsical. Click. Another photo, this time of the whole gnome family, all 10 of them, waving and tipping their hats. This is my project, I explained. These are animatronic sculptures. For the past 6 years, I have built a centerpiece for the silent auction at the annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala. My projects have, to date, raised over $40,000 for pediatric care in our city. I clicked to a slide showing a thank you letter from the hospital from the previous year. The industrial materials were sheets of acrylic for their display cases. The business deliveries were donated servo motors from a local supplier who supports the cause. The inconsistent noises were the sounds of me working to meet my deadline for this charity, a charity that President Brenda, through her actions, has done everything in her power to sabotage. The mood in the room had shifted completely. The homeowners weren't looking at me with suspicion anymore. They were looking at Brenda with open hostility. I saved the best for last. Click. The final slide was simple. It had a name, a phone number, and a logo for a prominent law firm in the city. Fact, I said, my voice now hard as steel. My attorney has already drafted a civil complaint against the Oakwood Estates HOA and its president for tortious interference, defamation, and illegal restraint of property. He advised me that our damages, including punitive, could easily reach 6 figures, a cost that would, of course, be paid by all of you via a massive special assessment fee. However, he advised me to wait until after this meeting before filing. He was curious to see which path you, the board, and the homeowners would choose to take. I turned off the projector. The silence in the room was absolute. I had laid out the facts, revealed the truth, and presented them with a choice. Side with the petty tyrant and face a disastrous lawsuit, or do the right thing. I walked back to my seat, the eyes of every person in the room following me. I had said my piece. The rest was up to them. The silence in the clubhouse stretched for a full 10 seconds, thick and heavy. All eyes swung from me to Brenda. Her face, which had been a mask of righteous fury, had crumbled into a waxy, pale visage of shock. She had been so certain of her victory, so wrapped up in her own power, that she never considered I would come so prepared. She had brought a binder full of rules to a gunfight, and I had just unveiled a PowerPoint presentation loaded with silver bullets. The first person to speak was not a board member, but Howard Gable, the HOA treasurer, a mild-mannered accountant who was known for his meticulously kept rose bushes and his quiet disposition. He stood up, his hand trembling slightly, not with fear, but with rage. "Brenda," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "is this true? Did you lock his gate without a board vote? Did you do all of this without consulting anyone?" Brenda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just stared at him, aghast that he, one of her loyal foot soldiers, would dare question her. "And you exposed us, all of us, to a 6-figure lawsuit?" he continued, his voice rising. "Over some garden gnomes? For a children's hospital? For God's sake, Brenda, my own granddaughter was treated there last year." That broke the dam. A chorus of angry voices erupted around the room. "I can't believe this!" shouted Mrs. Henderson. "My kids loved the kitten projection." "She tried to find me last month because my wind chimes were disharmonious," another neighbor chimed in. It was a full-blown mutiny. The quiet, compliant homeowners of Oakwood Estates had finally found their voice, and it was a roar of collective frustration aimed directly at their fallen queen. The other 2 board members looked at Brenda, then at the angry crowd, then back at each other. They were politicians, sensing a dramatic and irreversible shift in the polls. Their loyalty to Brenda evaporated in an instant. The vice president, a man named Bob, cleared his throat and banged the gavel weakly. Okay, let's have some order." He looked at me, then at the angry faces in the crowd. "In light of this new information, I believe the original motion is out of order." He looked directly at Howard Gable. Howard nodded, standing tall. "I'll make a new motion," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the presidency of Brenda." "Second," shouted at least a dozen people at once. It was a rout, a bloodless coup d'etat conducted under the fluorescent lights of a suburban clubhouse. The vote was a formality. Nearly every hand in the room went up in favor of ousting her. Brenda just sat there, utterly alone, as her carefully constructed empire crumbled around her. Bob, the newly minted acting president, moved quickly to do damage control. "Motion passes," he announced. "Brenda is removed as president, effective immediately." He then turned to me. "Mr. Jensen." "Alex. On behalf of the Oakwood Estates HOA, I would like to offer our sincerest, deepest apologies. This has been a travesty." He didn't stop there. In a rapid-fire series of motions, all of which passed unanimously, the board voted to have the lock on my workshop professionally removed at the HOA's expense first thing in the morning, immediately void and expunge all 11 violations and fines levied against me, draft a formal, written apology to me, Gus's custom fabrication, and Big Mike's towing. And finally, in a motion proposed by Howard Gable, the HOA voted to make a $5,000 donation to the Children's Hospital Foundation in my name. I sat there, stunned. I had come expecting to defend myself. I was leaving as the catalyst for a revolution. Brenda finally stood up, her face ashen, and without a word, she slunk out of the clubhouse, the fallen dictator escaping into exile. The room erupted in applause. The next morning, at the civilized hour of 9 a.m., a locksmith's van pulled up to my house. The locksmith, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, sheepishly approached my gate, bolt cutter in hand. He'd clearly been briefed on the situation. "You're the guy?" he asked. "I'm the guy," I confirmed. As he prepared to cut the chain, I walked over to the MCC. I fired up the power systems and patched my phone into the external speakers. I found what I was looking for. The throne room theme from the end of Star Wars. With a mighty snap of the bolt cutters, the chain fell away. The lock hit the pavement with a pathetic thud. At that exact moment, I hit play. The triumphant, brassy fanfare filled the morning air. The locksmith jumped, then looked at me and broke into a wide grin. He gave me a thumbs up. My gate was free. With the music swelling, I climbed into the driver's seat of the mobile command center. The diesel engine rumbled to life one last time on the streets of Oakwood Estates. I put it in gear and began my victory lap. I drove slowly, majestically, off the street, up my driveway, and into the cavernous bay of the lab. The garage door closed behind me, bringing my glorious, ridiculous, and utterly necessary protest to an end. The weeks that followed were a blur of peaceful, productive work. I finished the gnomes. They were, if I do say so myself, my finest work. At the charity gala, they were the star of the show. The bidding was furious. Between their final price and the HOA's surprise donation, we raised over $15,000 for the hospital. Life in Oakwood Estates returned to a new kind of normal. The new HOA board, led by a humbled and reasonable Bob, was a breath of fresh air. My wall of shame was carefully dismantled, and the framed violations were presented to me in a box at the next, much more cordial, HOA meeting as a memento of a period of transition. I keep them in my workshop, a reminder of the war we fought and won. Brenda was still around, a ghost haunting the neighborhood. I'd see her on her power walks, her face fixed in a permanent scowl, her eyes always pointedly away from my house. She never made eye contact. She never spoke to me again. Her power was broken, her reign of terror over. Months later, I was in my workshop, putting the final touches on a new project, a self-navigating, solar-powered lawnmower. I got a notification on my phone from a new security camera I'd installed overlooking the street. I tapped it open. The footage was priceless. A pizza delivery drone was hovering over the Hendersons' driveway, lowering its payload. And there, on the sidewalk below, was Brenda. She was standing on her tiptoes, trying desperately to slap a small, white sticker onto the drone's landing gear. I zoomed in. It was an HOA violation notice. I chuckled, a deep, satisfying laugh that came from the soul. I took a sip of my coffee, the rich aroma mixing with the familiar scent of my workshop. Some things, it seemed, would never change. But the balance of power certainly had. I had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, in the face of immovable, unreasonable authority, you can't just push back. You have to think bigger. You have to be smarter, more creative, and just a little bit more absurd. Sometimes the only way to deal with a petty tyrant who wants to lock up your world is to roll out your own self-contained, diesel-powered, espresso-making, freedom-dispensing mobile command center and remind them who's really in charge.